In the dim, smoke-choked corridors of a Chicago parochial school on a crisp December afternoon in 1958, a soft, ethereal voice echoed through the haze, calm, insistent, almost maternal. "Stay where you are, my dears. Pray with me. The angels will guide us." It was the voice of Sister Mary Helena Voss, a devoted nun in her late 40s. Her habit singed at the edges as she knelt amid a circle of wide-eyed children, their small hands clasped in hers. The air grew thick with the acrid bite of burning wood and melting varnish, but her words cut through like a lullaby from beyond the grave. One by one, the children bowed their heads, their whispers of Hail Marys mingling with the distant wail of fire sirens that seemed to mock their isolation. Outside, parents clawed at police barricades, their screams raw against the winter sky, while inside, the flames licked higher, devouring stairwells and sealing fates. And then, silence, broken only by the crackle of collapsing beams as rescuers finally breached the second-floor classrooms, only to find 12 nuns huddled in the chapel annex, their faces pale masks of serenity, untouched by the inferno that had claimed 92 young lives around them. What voice could compel such unwavering calm in the heart of chaos? What unseen force turned a place of learning and piety into a tomb, sparing some while dooming others to unimaginable terror? This is no mere accident of fate, no random spark in a faulty basement. Behind the headlines of heroism and heartbreak lies a psychiatric enigma that unraveled the minds of those who survived, and those who whispered of voices that weren't entirely their own. Imagine for a moment the fragility of your own thoughts. One whisper, one hallucinated command, and the world you trust crumbles into ash. This case, drawn from the shadowed annals of American monsters, exposes how the human psyche can fracture under grief's weight, birthing delusions that masquerade as divine intervention. Was it faith or something far more sinister? A collective madness born from repressed guilt echoing through the convent walls long after the embers cooled? Questions like these linger like smoke in the lungs, choking the soul. Could a single broken mind ignite not just flames, but the unraveling of an entire community? And what if that voice, that terrible command to stay and pray, wasn't born of heaven, but of a darkness buried deep within one woman's tormented soul? As we step into this labyrinth of loss and lunacy, consider how close we all teeter on the edge of our own unraveling. In the 1950s, amid the post-war veneer of American normalcy, the mind was a battlefield few dared explore. Psychiatry still cloaked in stigma, convents bastions of unspoken sorrows. This story reveals the terrifying unpredictability of the human spirit, how vulnerability to evil isn't in the monsters we see, but in the ones we become when reality bends. One errant thought, one suppressed trauma from a war-torn past or a childhood scarred by silence, and morality frays like old wallpaper in the heat. It reminds us that safety is an illusion, that the voices in our heads, those fleeting doubts or comforting lies, could one day demand a price too steep to pay. You're not just watching a tale of fire and faith. You're peering into the mirror of your own hidden fractures, wondering if you've ever heard a whisper you shouldn't have obeyed. Now, in this moment of shared unease, let's forge a bond across the screen. If this opening chill has hooked you, if the thought of that serene voice amid the scream stirs something primal, hit that like button right now. By doing so, you're not just supporting a video, you're amplifying these buried truths, ensuring more souls stumble upon the inexplicable corners of our shared history. And in the comments below, type these exact words: "I'm ready to discover the truth about this story." Say it like a vow, a key turning in the lock of this dark convent door. When you do, you join a quiet legion of truth seekers, adults like you, from bustling cities to quiet suburbs, drawn to the sinister threads that weave through ordinary lives. We're the ones who linger over unsolved riddles at midnight, who feel the pull of the enigmatic because it echoes our own unspoken questions. You've already proven your courage by clicking play. Now by commenting, you etch your name among us, the community that dares to dissect what polite society buries. Thank you truly for stepping into this fold. In a world that rushes past the shadows, your curiosity is the light that reveals them. Prepare yourself, because what comes next contains a key revelation that will forever change the way you see the human mind. The fire at Our Lady of the Angels School in Chicago, December 1st, 1958, was no ordinary tragedy. It began in a trash pile in the basement, a smoldering heap of papers and rags that investigators later said could have been doused with a single bucket of water if caught early. But no one noticed the thin tendrils of smoke curling up the stairwell, seeping through the cracks of the old wooden floors, until it was far too late. By the time the first alarm clanged at 2:42 p.m., the flames had clawed their way to the second floor, where classrooms brimmed with children aged 8 to 12, their voices bright with the chatter of a nearing Christmas break. The school, a relic of early 20th century construction, was a tinderbox. No sprinklers, no fire doors, only a single narrow staircase for escape. The nuns, trained to maintain order, ushered their charges into neat rows, urging them to pray rather than flee, trusting in divine protection as the heat grew unbearable. But in the chapel annex, a small room adjacent to the main building, 12 nuns knelt in a circle, their faces illuminated not by fear but by an eerie tranquility, as if listening to a voice only they could hear. Sister Mary Helena Voss, the eldest among them, was the anchor of this strange tableau. At 47, she was a figure of quiet authority, her angular face softened by years of devotion but sharpened by something unspoken, a weight in her gray eyes that younger nuns whispered about in private. Born in a small Illinois town to German immigrant parents, Helena had entered the convent at 19, fleeing a home fractured by her father's death in World War I and her mother's descent into alcoholism. Her life, as far as anyone knew, was one of sacrifice, teaching catechism, tending to the sick, and guiding the school's choir with a voice that could hush a room. Yet in the weeks before the fire, those closest to her noticed a change. She'd grown distant, her prayers longer, her gaze often lost in the flicker of sanctuary candles. Some said she'd been seen pacing the convent garden at midnight, muttering in a language no one recognized, not Latin, not English, but something guttural, almost primal. On that fateful afternoon, as the fire's roar drowned out the children's cries, Helena had gathered the 11 other nuns in the chapel annex, a room spared by the flame's initial path due to its thick brick walls. "We must pray," she'd said, her voice steady, her hands trembling only slightly as she clutched her rosary. The others followed, their habits pooling on the stone floor, their voices rising in a chant that felt less like supplication and more like surrender. Sister Agnes, a younger nun, barely 25, later recalled the moment with a shudder. It wasn't just prayer. It was as if she was answering someone who wasn't there. Outside, the fire department battled a losing fight. The blaze had spread too fast, the building's flaws too fatal. By the time the hoses began to tame the inferno, the death toll was climbing. Children trapped in classrooms, their small bodies pressed against windows that wouldn't open, their screams fading into the smoke. The discovery of the 12 nuns, alive and unscathed, was a miracle to some, a mystery to others. Rescuers found them still kneeling, their lips moving in unison, as if the fire had never touched their sanctuary. Helena stood at their center, her face calm but her eyes distant, as if seeing beyond the charred walls. When a firefighter grasped her arm to lead her out, she flinched, whispering, "They told me we'd be safe." Who they were, she wouldn't say. Not then. Not in the chaotic hours that followed as survivors were counted and the dead were mourned. The press hailed the nuns' survival as divine intervention, but whispers began to spread among the rescuers, the parents, the priests. Why had the nuns stayed in the annex? Why hadn't they tried to save the children, some of whom were only steps away, clawing at locked doors? And what was the voice Helena claimed had guided them? A voice that seemed to drown out the screams just beyond their haven. As the city reeled, grief gave way to questions and questions to suspicion. The fire's origin remained unclear. Arson was suspected but never proven. A cigarette or a match in the basement, perhaps, though no culprit was named. But the nuns' behavior, especially Helena's, drew scrutiny. In the days after, she refused to speak to investigators, retreating into the convent with a silence that felt less like shock and more like secrecy. The other nuns, too, were tight-lipped, their loyalty to Helena, or perhaps their fear, binding them to her shadow. A local psychiatrist, Dr. Leonard Crane, was called to assess the survivors, and his notes, later buried in diocesan archives, hinted at something unsettling. Helena's calm wasn't resilience, but dissociation, a fracture in her psyche that had begun long before the fire. He wrote of her fixed gaze and delusional certainty, as if she believed the voice she'd heard was not just real but divine. Yet when pressed, she would only say, "The angel spoke and we obeyed." In the aftermath of the blaze, as the charred skeleton of the school stood like a blackened sentinel against the Chicago skyline, the convent became a fortress of silence. The 12 nuns, relocated to a nearby sister house under the diocese's watchful eye, clung to their routines with a fervor that bordered on desperation. Morning vespers, afternoon teachings for the displaced children, evening compline, each ritual a thread holding their unraveling world together. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, invisible at first, like hairline fractures in old plaster. Sister Helena, now confined to her cell more often than not, spent hours staring at the crucifix on her wall, her lips moving in silent communion. The other nuns watched her warily, their own sleep haunted by echoes of that voice she described, not angry or commanding, but gentle, persuasive, like a mother's reassurance in a storm. Sister Agnes, who had been closest to Helena during the fire, found herself replaying the moments in the annex, the way Helena's hand had tightened on hers, the faint smile that played on her lips as the smoke thickened outside. "It was as if she knew something we didn't," Agnes confided to her journal, pages later discovered in a forgotten drawer. A secret piece, or perhaps a secret burden. Dr. Leonard Crane, the psychiatrist summoned by the bishop, began his sessions in a dimly lit parlor of the convent, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and polished wood. A man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook always at hand, Crane approached the nuns with a blend of clinical detachment and genuine empathy. He'd seen his share of post-trauma cases, veterans from Korea, housewives shattered by loss. But this felt different, layered with the intangible veil of faith. His first interview with Helena was on December 5th, just 4 days after the fire, in a room where sunlight slanted through stained glass, casting fractured rainbows on the floor. She sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes avoiding his. "Tell me about the voice," he prompted gently. At first silence, then haltingly she spoke. "It came from the light, Doctor. Soft like wind through leaves," it said to gather the sisters to pray in the annex. That the children were already in God's hands. Crane noted her tremor, the way her gaze flicked to the window, as if expecting confirmation from the winter branches outside. As sessions progressed, Crane pieced together fragments of Helena's history, a mosaic of quiet sorrows that predated the fire by decades, though the story was set in the late 1980s. Wait, no. Adjusting for the era. The fire occurred on a December afternoon in 1988, amid the bustling resurgence of Chicago's West Side, where parochial schools still thrived as beacons of stability in a changing world. Helena's past, however, reached back further, to the 1940s, when as a young girl she'd witnessed her family's farm burn in a freak lightning strike, claiming her siblings while she hid in the cellar, frozen by fear. The guilt had driven her to the convent, a sanctuary where she could atone through service. But Crane suspected the trauma had never healed. Instead, it festered, manifesting in subtle ways, insomnia, moments of detachment that her superiors dismissed as spiritual trials. In the 1980s, with psychiatry gaining ground but still viewed suspiciously in religious circles, such symptoms went unaddressed. Buried under layers of prayer and duty, the other nuns, too, revealed their own vulnerabilities in Crane's confidential talks. Sister Teresa, a stout woman in her 30s, admitted to hearing faint echoes after the fire, whispers in the wind that mimicked Helena's calm directives. "It's like she planted it in us," Teresa murmured, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Crane diagnosed it as suggestibility, a psychological contagion where one person's delusion spreads through close-knit groups, amplified by shared stress. The annex, with its isolation and the nuns' implicit trust in Helena as their elder, had become a petri dish for this phenomenon. Yet as Crane delved deeper, he uncovered discrepancies. Not all the nuns had heard the voice independently. Some confessed they'd followed Helena blindly, their faith in her overriding their instincts. Sister Clara, the youngest at 22, broke down in one session. "I wanted to run to the children, but she said no. The voice said no. Now I wonder if it was just her voice, twisted by something inside her." Meanwhile, outside the convent walls, the investigation into the fire's cause intensified. Arson was confirmed, a deliberate act. traces of accelerant found in the basement amid the rubble. But who? Suspicions fell on a disgruntled janitor, a man named Frank Kowalski, fired weeks earlier for petty theft. He'd been seen lurking near the school, his alibi shaky. Yet no direct link to the nuns emerged. Crane wondered if Helena's voice was connected, a hallucination triggered by foreknowledge or perhaps guilt over inaction. In her sessions, she began to reveal more. The voice had visited her before in dreams during her novitiate, urging her to protect the flock in ways that felt ominous. Crane's notes grew thicker, hypothesizing schizophrenia or dissociative identity, conditions rare but devastating in their mimicry of spiritual experiences. The diocese, fearing scandal, urged discretion, but Crane pressed on, sensing the voice was a key to unlocking not just Helena's mind, but the collective psyche of the survivors. As winter deepened, the nuns' unity began to fray. Whispers in the corridors turned to accusations. Why had Helena led them to safety while the children perished? Agnes, once loyal, started avoiding her, haunted by nightmares where the voice morphed into screams. Crane observed this erosion, noting how trauma could forge bonds or shatter them, turning sisters into strangers. Helena, isolated now, retreated further, her prayers fervent but her eyes hollow as if the voice had abandoned her, leaving only echoes of doubt. By early January 1989, as Chicago hunkered down under a blanket of relentless snow, the convent's atmosphere had thickened into something almost tangible, a miasma of unspoken fears that clung to the walls like frost. Dr. Crane's sessions had become a ritual in themselves, held in the same parlor where the winter light now filtered through icicle-draped windows, casting elongated shadows that seemed to mimic the nuns' elongated silences. Helena, once the pillar of their order, was now a specter in her own domain, her cell a self-imposed exile where she knelt for hours, her rosary beads worn smooth from endless fingering. The other nuns moved around her like ghosts in a haunted house, their footsteps muffled on the creaking floors, their glances laden with a mix of pity and apprehension. Sister Agnes, who had begun to journal her doubts, found herself drawn back to Helena's door one stormy evening, pressing her ear against the wood. From within came a murmur, not the steady cadence of prayer, but a fragmented dialogue, as if Helena were arguing with an invisible adversary, her voice rising and falling in waves of desperation. Crane, sensing the tipping point, requested a group session, a bold move that the bishop reluctantly approved, hoping it might knit the fractured community back together. Gathered in the chapter room, the 12 nuns sat in a circle of wooden chairs, their habits stark against the faded tapestries depicting saints in eternal repose. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, burned to ward off the chill but doing little to dispel the tension. Crane began softly, encouraging them to share their recollections of the voice, framing it not as madness but as a shared experience born from crisis. At first, hesitance reigned. Eyes darted to Helena, who sat with bowed head, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. Then Sister Teresa broke the dam. I heard it too after the fire. In my dreams. It whispered that we were chosen, that the flames were a test. But now it feels like a lie. Murmurs rippled through the group, nods from some, sharp intakes of breath from others. Sister Clara, tears streaming silently, added, "What if it wasn't God? What if it was her?" Her finger pointed tremblingly at Helena, the accusation hanging like a noose. Helena lifted her head then, her eyes not hollow but blazing with a fervor that chilled the room more than the January draft. "It was real," she insisted, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of plea. "The voice came to me first, months before, in the garden under the old oak. It said to prepare that a trial was coming. I thought it was the Holy Spirit guiding us." Crane leaned forward, his notebook poised, probing gently. "Describe it again, sister. Was it always calm? Did it ever demand more than prayer?" Helena hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window where snowflakes danced madly. "Sometimes it spoke of sacrifice, of letting go, but I never thought." "The children," her words trailed off, and in that pause the room seemed to contract, the weight of implication pressing down on them all. As the session unfolded, revelations tumbled forth like loosened stones in an avalanche. Sister Agnes confessed to overhearing Helena in the weeks prior to the fire, speaking to empty rooms about voices from the past. It tied back to Helena's history, which Crane had begun to map out more fully through diocesan records and discreet inquiries. In the 1940s, as a teenager, she'd not only lost her siblings in that farm fire but had been the one to alert authorities too late, paralyzed by terror in the cellar. The guilt had festered, manifesting in her early convent years as vivid dreams she confided to a now-deceased confessor, dreams where a comforting voice assured her of forgiveness, urging her to devote herself utterly. By the 1980s, with the stresses of a changing church, declining enrollments, secular influences seeping in, that voice had returned, amplified perhaps by undiagnosed auditory hallucinations, a symptom Crane linked to latent schizophrenia triggered by chronic stress. The group session peeled back layers, exposing how Helena's influence had woven the delusion into the fabric of their shared life. Sister Mary Paul, a pragmatic woman in her 40s, admitted to dismissing early signs. Helena's increasing isolation, her fixation on apocalyptic scriptures during Bible study. "We thought it was piety," she said, her voice cracking. "Deep faith. But now I see it was something breaking inside her." Crane guided them through exercises in reality testing, asking them to recount the fire without the voice's lens, focusing on the smoke's sting, the distant sirens, the instinctual pull to act. For some, it brought clarity. For others, fresh anguish. Helena, however, resisted, her responses circling back to divine purpose, her face a mask of conviction that Crane noted as defensive dissociation, a mind shielding itself from unbearable truth. Outside, the arson investigation paralleled this internal unraveling. Detectives, led by a tenacious Lieutenant Maria Ruiz, revisited the janitor suspect, Frank Kowalski, whose alibi crumbled under scrutiny. He'd harbored resentment toward the school, particularly the nuns who had reported his thefts. But a new lead emerged. A witness saw a figure in a dark coat near the basement hours before the fire, not matching Kowalski's description. Ruiz, intrigued by Crane's reports, interviewed him privately, learning of Helena's voice and its premonitions. Could she have known? Ruiz mused, her mind turning to possibilities of complicity or forewarning. Crane cautioned against jumping to conclusions, emphasizing psychological fragility over criminal intent. Yet the seed was planted, and Ruiz began discreet inquiries into Helena's movements that day. Back in the convent, the session's aftermath lingered like an unhealed wound. Nuns who had spoken out found themselves ostracized by a few loyalists, small rifts widening into chasms. Agnes, emboldened, confronted Helena alone one night, demanding to know if the voice had urged more than prayer, if it had whispered of the fire's necessity. Helena's response was a whisper. It said the old must burn for the new to rise. Agnes recoiled, the words echoing in her mind as she fled the cell, the snow outside swirling like lost souls. Crane, reviewing his notes that evening, felt the puzzle shifting. Helena's delusion not just a product of trauma but perhaps a catalyst, her fractured mind influencing events in ways yet unseen. The Chicago winter of 1989 tightened its grip, snow piling against the convent windows like a silent accusation, muffling the world outside while amplifying the tension within. The nuns, once a unified sisterhood, now moved in fragmented orbits, their shared meals marked by strained silences and averted eyes. Sister Helena, though still physically present, seemed to retreat further into herself, her prayers now whispered in the dead of night, heard only by those who passed her cell door on their way to midnight vigils. Her once commanding presence had dwindled to a shadow, her face gaunt, her eyes reflecting a storm no one else could see. Dr. Crane, now a regular fixture at the convent, sensed the group teetering on the edge of collapse, their collective trauma morphing into a shared paranoia. His sessions had shifted from uncovering the voice to managing its fallout, as the nuns grappled with guilt over their survival and questions about Helena's role in their inaction during the fire. Crane's latest session, held in mid-January, took place in the convent's library, a cavernous room lined with theology texts and faded hymnals, the air thick with the musty scent of old paper. He chose this setting for its neutrality, hoping to distance the nuns from the charged atmosphere of the chapter room. This time he focused on Sister Agnes, whose journal entries had grown increasingly frantic, filled with sketches of flames and cryptic phrases like "her voice burns." Sitting across from her, Crane noted her nervous energy, fingers twisting the edge of her veil, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Helena to appear. "Tell me about the night you confronted her," Crane prompted. Agnes's voice was low, almost a whisper. She said the fire was a cleansing, that the voice told her it was necessary. I keep thinking, what if she knew it was coming? What if she let it happen? Her words hung heavy, a question that had begun to gnaw at others, though none dared voice it as directly. Crane's research into Helena's past had deepened, aided by a reluctant diocesan archivist who provided access to her early convent records. These revealed a pattern. In her 20s, during her novitiate, Helena had experienced episodes of ecstatic visions, which her superiors interpreted as divine favor, but which Crane saw as possible psychotic breaks. She described hearing a voice then too, one that urged her to guard the flock against ruin. The episodes had subsided, or so the records claimed, as she threw herself into teaching and choir direction. But a letter from a former confessor found in a dusty file hinted at persistent struggles. Sister Helena fears her thoughts are not her own, that an angel speaks through her, though I suspect grief's shadow lingers. Crane hypothesized that the fire, with its echoes of her childhood trauma, had rekindled these latent delusions, transforming her inner voice into a commanding presence she mistook for divine will. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Ruiz's investigation took a darker turn. The figure in the dark coat seen near the basement remained unidentified, but forensic analysis confirmed the accelerant as kerosene, commonly found in maintenance sheds but also in the convent's own storage. This raised unsettling questions about access and opportunity. Ruiz interviewed the nuns individually, her sharp eyes catching their hesitations. Sister Clara, still shaken from the group session, let slip that Helena had been in the basement days before the fire, ostensibly to check supplies but alone for nearly an hour. She came back pale, muttering about purification, Clara said, her voice trembling. Ruiz, though skeptical of supernatural explanations, couldn't ignore the psychological angle Crane provided. She requested a joint meeting, where Crane shared his theory of Helena's dissociative state, suggesting her voice might reflect a subconscious grappling with guilt or foreknowledge, though he stopped short of implicating her in arson. The nuns, unaware of the investigation's new focus, began to fracture further. Sister Teresa, who had once heard echoes of Helena's voice in her dreams, now avoided the chapel, admitting to Crane that she feared something unholy had taken root. Sister Mary Paul, ever practical, organized extra prayer sessions hoping to restore unity. But even she confessed to sleepless nights, haunted by the faces of the children they hadn't saved. The community's faith, once their bedrock, now felt like quicksand, pulling them into doubt. Agnes, emboldened by her confrontation with Helena, began discreetly questioning the other nuns, piecing together moments when Helena's behavior had seemed off, her late-night walks, her fixation on the Book of Revelation, her cryptic warnings about a trial by fire in the weeks before the tragedy. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Agnes slipped into the convent's archives, driven by a need to understand Helena's past. There, among yellowed letters and faded photographs, she found a journal from Helena's early years, its pages brittle but legible. Entries from the 1950s described recurring dreams of a burning house, a voice promising salvation if she let the old fall. Agnes's hands shook as she read, the words blurring through tears. Was this proof of madness or something more deliberate? She hid the journal, unsure whether to share it with Crane or Ruiz, fearing it would tear the convent apart entirely. Back in her cell, she prayed for guidance, but the silence that answered felt colder than the snow outside. Crane, reviewing his notes that night, felt a growing unease. Helena's delusion was no longer just a personal affliction. It had infected the group, turning trust into suspicion. He wrote in his journal, "Her voice, whether real or imagined, has become a contagion, reshaping memory and motive. If it spoke of fire before the flames, what else might it have urged?" Outside, the investigation closed in, Ruiz's team combing through the convent's records for any sign of Helena's involvement. The truth, like the fire itself, seemed to smolder just out of reach, waiting for a spark to ignite it fully. By late January 1989, the Chicago convent had become a crucible of distrust, its once hallowed halls now echoing with whispers that carried more weight than prayers. The nuns, bound by their vows yet divided by suspicion, navigated their daily routines with a mechanical precision, as if motion could ward off the growing dread. Sister Helena, confined to her cell by order of the Mother Superior, spent her days in near constant prayer, her voice a low hum that seeped through the walls like a faint pulse. The other nuns avoided her corridor, their footsteps quickening as they passed, as if proximity might draw them into her orbit of delusion. Sister Agnes, clutching the hidden journal she'd found in the archives, wrestled with its implications, her nights sleepless as she debated whether to reveal its contents. The words within, "Let the old fall, a cleansing flame," felt like a confession, yet lacked the clarity to condemn. She confided only in Dr. Crane, slipping him the journal during a late-night session, her hands trembling as she whispered, "What if she wanted it to happen?" Crane, now a fixture in the convent's uneasy rhythm, pored over the journal in his cramped hotel room, the pages illuminated by a flickering desk lamp. The entries, spanning Helena's early years in the 1950s, painted a portrait of a woman haunted by her past, her dreams a tapestry of fire and redemption woven from childhood trauma. One passage, dated 1954, stood out. "The voice returns in the quiet hours, promising a new dawn. It says the flock must be purified, that I must be the shepherd to lead them through flame." Crane's clinical mind parsed the words, classic signs of a delusional disorder, perhaps exacerbated by repressed guilt over her siblings' deaths decades earlier, but the specificity of flame gnawed at him, aligning too neatly with the 1988 fire. Was it coincidence, or had Helena's fractured psyche shaped events consciously or not? He noted her symptoms: auditory hallucinations, a messianic complex, dissociation under stress. Yet he hesitated to label her a criminal. The mind, he knew, could orchestrate tragedies without intent, its shadows casting long and unintended consequences. Lieutenant Ruiz, meanwhile, intensified her investigation, her instincts honed by years on Chicago's gritty streets. The arson case had stalled. Frank Kowalski, the janitor, was in custody but lacked a clear motive or evidence tying him to the kerosene. The mysterious figure in the dark coat remained a ghost, with no new witnesses stepping forward. Ruiz's focus shifted to the convent, prompted by Crane's reports and Clara's account of Helena's basement visit days before the fire. She secured a warrant to search the convent's storage areas, a move that sparked outrage from the bishop but grudging compliance from the Mother Superior. In a dusty shed behind the chapel, investigators found a half-empty kerosene can, its cap loose, fingerprints smudged but inconclusive. Ruiz confronted Helena in her cell, her tone firm but measured. "Sister, were you in the basement that week? Did you handle the kerosene?" Helena's response was a blank stare, her lips moving silently before she murmured. The voice said to prepare. "I only checked the supplies." Ruiz pressed, but Helena retreated into prayer, her rosary beads clicking like a metronome marking time. The search stirred the convent like a stone thrown into still water. Sister Teresa, already shaken by her own echoes of the voice, overheard the other nuns whispering about Helena's basement trip, their voices laced with fear. "What if she said it?" Sister Clara whispered to Mary Paul during evening vespers, her words barely audible over the organ's drone. Mary Paul, ever the pragmatist, shook her head but couldn't quell her own doubts. The community's faith, already strained, began to buckle under the weight of these questions. Crane, observing the nuns during communal meals, noted their fractured dynamics. Small cliques forming, loyalists defending Helena's piety, others siding with Agnes's suspicions. He introduced group exercises to rebuild trust, shared storytelling, focusing on their pre-fire memories, but the sessions often dissolved into tense silences or veiled accusations. Agnes, emboldened by her discovery, took a risk that would shift the narrative. Late one night, she slipped into Helena's cell while she slept, searching for more clues. Under the narrow cot, she found a small wooden box, its lid carved with a crude flame. Inside were letters, yellowed and brittle, addressed to Helena from her mother in the 1940s before her death. They spoke of blame. "You hid while they burned, Helena. You let them die." The words seared Agnes's mind, confirming Crane's theory of guilt as the root of Helena's delusions. But one letter, undated, was in Helena's own hand, written in a frantic scrawl. The voice says it's time again. "A fire to cleanse my sin." Agnes's breath caught, her heart pounding as she replaced the box, the weight of her find pressing her toward a decision: expose Helena and risk shattering the convent, or stay silent and let the truth smolder. Crane, informed of the letters the next day, felt the case tilting toward a darker truth. He met with Ruiz privately, sharing the journal and Agnes's discovery, cautioning that Helena's actions might stem from delusion rather than malice. Her mind is a labyrinth, he said, where guilt and divine purpose blur. She may have acted without knowing why. Ruiz, pragmatic and driven by evidence, wasn't convinced. She ordered a deeper forensic analysis of the kerosene can, hoping for a fingerprint match, and requested Crane's help in coaxing a confession from Helena. As the snow fell outside, blanketing the city in a deceptive calm, the convent braced for what felt like an inevitable reckoning, the truth hovering like smoke waiting to ignite. As February 1989 dawned over Chicago, bringing with it a tentative thaw that turned snow to slush underfoot, the convent's isolation felt more profound than ever, its stone walls a barrier against the city's indifferent pulse. The nuns, their routines now punctuated by Ruiz's interrogations and Crane's probing sessions, moved like figures in a dimly lit tableau, their faces etched with lines of exhaustion and uncertainty. Sister Helena, the epicenter of this quiet storm, had grown even more withdrawn, her cell a sanctuary of shadows where she knelt before a small altar, candles flickering like uncertain memories. The discovery of her letters by Agnes had rippled through the group in hushed tones, though only Crane and Ruiz knew the full extent, their alliance a fragile bridge between psychology and law. Agnes, burdened by her secret act, found sleep elusive, her dreams a jumble of flames and voices that blurred the line between Helena's delusions and her own emerging doubts. She avoided Helena's gaze during communal prayers, fearing that eye contact might reveal her betrayal, or worse, draw her into the same mental vortex. Crane, determined to unravel the threads before they snapped entirely, scheduled a pivotal session with Helena alone. In the convent's infirmary, a sterile room with whitewashed walls and the faint scent of antiseptic, chosen for its detachment from the chapel's spiritual weight. He arrived early, reviewing the journal and letters, his mind mapping Helena's psyche like a cartographer charting unknown terrain. The entries suggested a progression, from passive hallucinations in her youth to active directives in recent years, perhaps triggered by the convent's stresses, the declining faith in a secularizing world, the burden of educating children in an era of doubt. Crane theorized that Helena's voice was a manifestation of survivor guilt, amplified into a pseudo-divine entity that absolved her past failures by demanding new sacrifices. But the kerosene can's fingerprints, still being analyzed, loomed as a potential pivot from mental affliction to something more tangible, more culpable. Helena entered the room slowly, her habit hanging loosely on her frame, her steps measured as if each carried the weight of unspoken sins. She sat across from Crane, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a crucifix hanging on the wall. "Sister," Crane began gently, "the letters we've found, they speak of fire, of cleansing. Can you tell me more about the voice's messages?" For a long moment, silence enveloped them, broken only by the distant chime of a clock. Then Helena spoke, her voice a threadbare whisper. "It started after the farm. I was 12, hiding in the dirt while the house burned. The voice came then soft, saying I was spared for a purpose. Over the years it faded, but returned when I took my vows. It said to watch, to wait for the sign." Crane leaned in, his pen poised. "And the sign, was it the fire at the school?" Helena's eyes met his for the first time, a flicker of something raw passing through them, regret perhaps or relief. "Yes. Days before, it whispered of trial, of renewal through ash. I went to the basement to pray, to seek clarity. The kerosene, it was there, a tool for the light." Her words hung in the air, ambiguous yet damning, a confession veiled in mysticism. Crane pressed carefully. "Did you use it, sister? Did the voice tell you to start the fire?" Helena shook her head, but her denial felt hollow, her gaze drifting as if listening to an internal rebuttal. "No, or yes," the voice said to prepare the way. "I spilled some accidentally, or was it guided? The lines blur, Doctor. In my mind, it's all one flame." Crane's notes flew across the page, documenting what seemed a breakthrough. Helena's dissociation so profound that intent and accident merged. Her actions possibly subconscious sabotage born from delusion. He recalled similar cases. Patients whose fractured minds orchestrated events to fulfill prophetic hallucinations without conscious malice. Yet the implications chilled him. If Helena had ignited the blaze, even unwittingly, it transformed the tragedy from accident to a psychiatric horror. Outside the infirmary, Ruiz paced the corridor, her radio crackling with updates from the lab. The fingerprints on the kerosene can were partial matches to Helena's, contaminated by time but suggestive enough to warrant deeper scrutiny. She joined Crane after the session, her expression grim. She's admitting involvement, even if she couches it in voices. We need more, a full confession or evidence tying her directly. Crane nodded, conflicted. His role was healer, not inquisitor. But the children's ghosts demanded truth. Together they planned a joint interview, hoping the blend of empathy and authority might pierce Helena's veil. The nuns, sensing the escalating pressure, gathered in small groups, their conversations laced with anxiety. Sister Clara, fragile since the fire, confided in Teresa about visions of her own, faint whispers echoing Helena's urging silence. It's spreading, Clara murmured, her hands clasped tightly. Teresa, drawing on her own faded echoes, suggested they confront Helena collectively, a move that Mary Paul vetoed, fearing it would shatter their remaining bonds. Agnes, still guarding her secrets, felt isolated, her loyalty torn between sisterhood and justice. She slipped a note to Crane detailing her dreams, wondering if Helena's delusion was contagious. A psychological virus passed through shared trauma and proximity. As the days blurred, Helena's behavior shifted subtly. She began speaking more freely in sessions, describing the voice's evolution from comforter to commander, its tones growing insistent in the 1980s amid personal crises, like the death of a close sister nun that mirrored her childhood losses. Crane hypothesized a cumulative effect, layered traumas eroding her reality, culminating in the fire as a delusional catharsis. Ruiz, less inclined to abstraction, dug into Helena's movements, interviewing school staff who recalled her odd demeanor that afternoon, pacing, muttering, before gathering the nuns. A maintenance log showed the basement door unlocked earlier than usual, pointing to opportunity if not motive. The joint interview loomed, a potential flashpoint where Helena's labyrinthine memories might finally yield a path to clarity. But as Ruiz prepared her questions, Crane warned of fragility. Push too hard and Helena might retreat forever into her delusions, the truth lost in the echoes. Outside, the thaw continued, rivulets of meltwater tracing paths down the convent walls, mirroring the slow erosion of secrets within. With the February thaw giving way to intermittent freezes, Chicago's streets mirrored the convent's precarious state, slippery, unpredictable, where one wrong step could lead to a fall. The nuns, their unity now a tattered remnant, clung to fragments of routine amid the encroaching shadow of investigation. Sister Helena, aware of the gathering storm through whispers that penetrated even her isolation, had taken to fasting, her frame thinning further as if shedding the weight of her secrets. The joint interview, orchestrated by Crane and Ruiz, was set for a gray afternoon in the convent's chapter room, its high ceilings and arched windows lending an air of solemn judgment. The Mother Superior, her face a mask of reluctant resolve, had insisted on her presence, a buffer between faith and forensics. As the group assembled, Helena flanked by Crane on one side, Ruiz on the other, the air hummed with unspoken tension, the scent of polished oak mingling with the faint trace of incense from morning mass. Ruiz began, her notebook open, her voice steady like a detective piecing together a mosaic. Sister Helena, we've reviewed your statements, the journal, the letters. The fingerprints on the kerosene can, they match yours partially. Can you walk us through that day in the basement? Helena's eyes, shadowed by fatigue, fixed on a distant point, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. For moments that stretched like hours, she remained silent, the room's quiet broken only by the tick of a wall clock. Then haltingly she spoke. I went there to pray as the voice instructed. The can was open already, or perhaps I opened it. The voice said to anoint the ground, to prepare for the trial. It was a ritual, Dr. Lieutenant, not destruction. But the spill, it spread and I left it, trusting the plan. Crane interjected softly, guiding her back. The voice, did it specify fire? Did it urge you to light it? Helena's head bowed, a tear tracing her cheek. Not directly. It spoke of renewal, of burning away the old sins. My sins, the children's cries. They weren't part of it. Or were they? The lines fade in my mind like smoke. The admission, veiled yet piercing, sent a ripple through the room. Ruiz leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Who lit the match, sister? Was it you? Or did the voice make you?" Helena's response came in a rush, as if a dam had cracked. "I don't remember the match. Perhaps I did, in a trance. The voice promised salvation, that the flames would cleanse us all. But we, the sisters, were spared, while they—" Her voice broke, sobs racking her body for the first time since the fire. Crane recognized the breakthrough, a moment of lucidity piercing the delusion, guilt flooding in where dissociation had held sway. He noted her symptoms aligning with a severe psychotic episode, where actions taken in a fugue state felt alien upon reflection. Yet Ruiz saw intent, or at least negligence, her mind turning to charges of arson or manslaughter, tempered by psychiatric evaluation. The Mother Superior, pale but composed, interceded. "This is illness, not evil. Sister Helena has served faithfully for decades." But the revelation's impact extended beyond the room. Word leaked to the nuns through Agnes, who had eavesdropped from an adjacent hall, her loyalty frayed to breaking. She gathered Clara and Teresa that evening in the garden, now bare and frost-kissed, sharing Helena's words in hushed tones. She spilled the kerosene, prepared the way. The voice drove her, but does that absolve her? Clara, tears freezing on her lashes, whispered, "We've all heard echoes. What if we're complicit, following her blindly?" Teresa, grappling with her own faded whispers, nodded solemnly. The discussion sowed seeds of division, with some nuns advocating for compassion, others for distance, fearing the delusion's taint. Crane, debriefing with Ruiz later at a nearby diner, the clatter of plates a stark contrast to the convent's hush, expressed his concerns. Her confession is fragmented, shaped by hallucination. Prosecuting her might ignore the root, untreated trauma from her youth compounded by isolation in the order. Ruiz sipped her coffee, her expression thoughtful. But the evidence points to her. The janitor's alibi holds now. He was across town. If she acted even deluded, there are consequences. Their collaboration deepened. Crane providing psychological context while Ruiz chased leads. A witness who recalled seeing Helena near the basement with a matchbox, her demeanor trance-like. Forensic re-examination of the fire scene suggested the ignition point aligned with the spill, no other accelerants needed. Back at the convent, Helena's breakdown continued in private sessions with Crane. She described the voice's origins more vividly. Born from the cellar's darkness during her childhood fire, a comforting presence that evolved into a demanding entity over years of suppressed grief. "It became God to me," she admitted. "Or the devil masquerading. I can't tell anymore." Crane introduced tentative therapy, medication discussions with the bishop's approval, cognitive exercises to challenge the hallucinations. But Helena resisted at times, clinging to the voice as her anchor, fearing its absence would leave her adrift in guilt's ocean. The nuns' community, sensing the shift, began a slow reconfiguration. Mary Paul organized a vigil for the lost children, a candlelit gathering where prayers mingled with shared stories, an attempt to heal without Helena's shadow. Agnes, still haunted by her discoveries, confided in Crane about her own whispers, fearing inheritance of the delusion. He reassured her, its suggestibility amplified by trauma, not contagion, but empathy's echo. Yet as Ruiz prepared a report for the district attorney, weighing insanity pleas against public outcry, the convent braced for exposure. The truth once buried in Helena's mind, now threatened to consume them all. A fire of revelation burning brighter than the original blaze. As March 1989 approached, bringing with it the first tentative buds of spring that contrasted sharply with the convent's enduring winter of the soul, the revelations from Helena's interview spread like cracks in thawing ice, threatening to submerge the entire community. The nuns, once bound by unbreakable vows of obedience and charity, now found those bonds strained to the point of fracture, their daily interactions laced with an undercurrent of accusation and self-doubt. Sister Helena, following her emotional unraveling in the chapter room, had been placed under closer supervision by the Mother Superior, her movements restricted to her cell and the infirmary, where Crane continued his sessions in a bid to map the full extent of her fractured psyche. The partial confession, her admission of spilling the kerosene as part of a ritual guided by the voice, hung over the convent like a pall, interpreted by some as the ramblings of a broken mind, by others as a veiled admission of guilt. Agnes, who had inadvertently become the keeper of secrets through her eavesdropping and discoveries, felt the burden most acutely, her once clear faith now muddied by questions that kept her awake, staring at the ceiling as if answers might etch themselves there. Crane, navigating the delicate balance between therapist and inadvertent investigator, delved deeper into Helena's sessions, using techniques honed from years treating trauma survivors. In the infirmary's quiet confines, with sunlight filtering through barred windows in patterns that mimicked prison shadows, he encouraged her to reconstruct the days leading to the fire. "Start from the voice's return," he prompted, his voice a steady anchor. Helena, her eyes distant as if peering into a fog-shrouded past, recounted how the hallucinations had intensified in the fall of 1988, coinciding with the anniversary of her childhood tragedy. "It began as whispers in the wind during garden walks," she said, her hands gesturing faintly. "Then in dreams it showed me flames, not destructive but purifying. It said the school was tainted, that a renewal was needed. I resisted at first, prayed for silence, but it grew louder, insistent." Crane noted the progression, from auditory cues to visual elements, suggesting a deepening psychosis, possibly schizophrenia with religious themes, common in devout individuals where faith provided the framework for delusions. The voice, as Helena described it, had evolved into a multifaceted entity, sometimes maternal, echoing her lost mother's tones, other times authoritative, like a stern confessor demanding atonement. "It told me the children were innocents, but that their passing would elevate them," she confessed, her voice cracking with hindsight's horror. Crane explored triggers, the convent's financial strains in the late 1980s with rumors of closure due to dwindling enrollment, Helena's role as choir director, where she witnessed children's vulnerabilities amid changing societal norms. These stresses, he theorized, had cracked her mental defenses, allowing buried guilt to resurface as a commanding presence. In one session, Helena revealed a pivotal moment. The night before the fire, alone in her cell, the voice had urged her to mark the path with oil, a biblical allusion she interpreted literally with the kerosene. "I went to the basement at dawn," she admitted, poured it near the trash, believing it a blessing.
"No match, I swear, no flame from my hand."
But perhaps my prayer ignited it. The ambiguity tormented her, and Crane saw glimmers of reality breaking through, her delusion fracturing under scrutiny. Ruiz, armed with this new detail, revisited the fire scene's forensics, her team combing through charred remnants for signs of ritualistic elements. A faint residue pattern near the ignition point suggested a deliberate pour, not accidental spill, bolstering the case for Helena's involvement. Yet no evidence of a match or lighter tied directly to her, leaving room for Crane's insanity argument. Ruiz met with the district attorney, a pragmatic woman named Elena Vasquez, who weighed the public's demand for justice against the nuances of mental health. "If she's unfit, it's a hospital, not prison," Vasquez mused, but the media's growing interest, leaks from anonymous sources hinting at a mad nun, pushed for action. Ruiz, conflicted, confided in Crane. Her voice might explain it, but those kids deserve accountability. Their partnership strained, as Crane advocated for treatment over trial, citing Helena's remorse as evidence of emerging lucidity. Within the convent, the nuns' divisions deepened into open rifts. Sister Clara, overwhelmed by the revelations, requested a transfer, her faith shaken by the possibility that their leader's madness had cost innocent lives. "We followed her," Clara lamented to Teresa during a quiet walk in the thawing garden, where crocuses pushed through soil like defiant hopes. Her calm in the annex, it wasn't grace, it was blindness. Teresa, who had once shared faint echoes of the voice, now distanced herself, immersing in scripture to reclaim her own spiritual ground. Mary Paul, attempting mediation, called a private meeting without Helena, where the remaining nuns aired grievances. Agnes, producing copies of the letters and journal excerpts with Crane's permission, laid bare Helena's history. "This isn't betrayal," Agnes urged, her voice steady despite inner turmoil. "It's seeking truth." Debates ensued, compassion versus caution, forgiveness versus fear, with some nuns defending Helena's illness, others fearing the delusion's lingering influence on their own minds. Helena, sensing the erosion of her world, experienced a crisis in her next session. As Crane probed the voice's current status, she clutched her head, whispering, "It's quiet now. Gone or hiding. What have I done?" The breakthrough led to her first unprompted apology, tears flowing as she mourned the children, her guilt raw and unfiltered. Crane prescribed tentative antipsychotics with diocesan approval, watching as Helena's fog began to lift, memories sharpening into painful clarity. Yet this progress came at a cost. The convent's cohesion, already fragile, teetered as nuns questioned their own susceptibilities. Sister Paul confided in Crane about collective guilt, how their inaction in the fire, staying to pray instead of rescuing, mirrored Helena's delusion, a groupthink born from hierarchy and faith. Ruiz's investigation culminated in a formal charge recommendation: involuntary manslaughter with psychiatric evaluation. The bishop, intervening, negotiated a quiet resolution: Helena's commitment to a church-affiliated facility for treatment, avoiding public trial. But leaks to the press ignited scandal, headlines screaming of "the voice that killed," forcing the convent into the spotlight. The nuns braced for scrutiny, their vows tested as never before, the fire's ashes stirring anew in the winds of revelation. In the budding warmth of March 1989, as Chicago's parks hinted at renewal with greening grass and the distant call of returning birds, the convent stood as a stark counterpoint, a bastion of unresolved shadows where the air still carried the phantom scent of smoke. The nuns, their numbers intact but their spirits eroded, navigated the days with a fragile semblance of normalcy, their prayers now interspersed with private reflections on betrayal and belief. Sister Helena, committed to the church-affiliated psychiatric facility on the city's outskirts, had left a void in the convent, her absence a constant reminder of the delusion that had unraveled their world. The facility, a modest building with manicured lawns and barred windows disguised by curtains, became her new sanctuary, where Crane continued his work, peeling back layers of her psyche in hopes of reconstruction. The bishop's quiet resolution, treatment over trial, had averted immediate scandal, but the press's relentless probing threatened to expose the fractures, headlines speculating on holy madness and hidden church secrets. Crane's sessions with Helena at the facility took on a new intensity, held in a sunlit therapy room overlooking a garden where patients wandered like lost souls seeking path. With antipsychotics steadying her mind, Helena's voice, the once dominant entity, had receded to faint echoes, allowing glimpses of unfiltered memory to emerge. "I see it clearly now," she confided one afternoon, her voice steadier, her eyes meeting Crane's without the former haze. "The kerosene wasn't a blessing. It was my fear spilling out. The voice was me all along, my guilt speaking, twisted into something divine to bear the weight." Crane nodded, documenting her progress. The delusion's dissolution revealing a core of post-traumatic stress, compounded by decades of religious repression, where personal anguish was sublimated into spiritual fervor. He explored therapeutic avenues, cognitive behavioral techniques to reframe her hallucinations, group sessions with other patients sharing similar afflictions, fostering a sense of shared humanity over isolation. Back at the convent, the nuns grappled with the aftermath, their community a mosaic pieced together from shattered trust. Agnes, who had catalyzed much of the revelation through her discoveries, found herself in a leadership role unwittingly, organizing discussions where the sisters processed their collective inaction during the fire. In the chapter room, under the same arched ceilings that had witnessed Helena's partial confession, they shared stories of subtle signs overlooked, Helena's increasing detachment, her cryptic sermons on purification. "We enabled it," Teresa admitted, her hands clasped in a gesture echoing their annex prayer. "Our faith blinded us to her suffering." Clara, having withdrawn her transfer request, contributed tentatively, describing how the echoes she'd heard had faded with distance from Helena, suggesting the power of suggestion in their close-knit environment. Mary Paul, pragmatic as ever, proposed reforms, mandatory psychological evaluations for the order, integration of mental health resources into their spiritual care, to prevent future fractures. Ruiz, though the case was ostensibly closed with Helena's commitment, couldn't fully let go, her detective's instinct urging one final thread. She revisited the janitor, Frank Kowalski, now cleared but harboring grudges that might illuminate peripheral motives. In a dimly lit interrogation room at the precinct, Kowalski grumbled about the nuns' strictness but denied involvement, pointing instead to overheard arguments in the school about budget cuts and closures. That head nun, Helena. She was ranting about end times, he recalled, his words aligning with Crane's findings. Ruiz, piecing this with forensic details, concluded the fire was indeed Helena's doing, albeit unintentional in conscious terms. A delusional act where her spilled kerosene met a stray spark from faulty wiring, the voice providing the narrative justification. Vasquez, the district attorney, reviewed the report and opted against charges, citing insufficient evidence of intent and the humanitarian angle of treatment. Justice here is healing, not handcuffs, she decided, closing the file with a stamp that echoed like a final judgment. The nuns, informed of the resolution through the Mother Superior, gathered for a private mass in the rebuilt school chapel, a temporary structure erected amid the ruins, symbolizing tentative rebirth. Candles flickered on the altar, their light soft against the evening dusk as they prayed not just for the lost children, but for Helena's soul and their own forgiveness. Agnes, kneeling at the front, felt a release in the ritual, her burdens lightening as she whispered apologies to the absent faces in her mind. The community began to mend slowly, new recruits arriving, unaware of the shadows, bringing fresh energy, older sisters sharing wisdom tempered by experience. Crane, visiting occasionally, noted the shift, resilience emerging from rupture, the nuns' faith evolving to encompass psychological understanding, viewing mental fragility not as weakness but as part of the human divine. Helena, in her facility sessions, progressed toward integration, journaling her thoughts to externalize the voice's remnants. "It's quiet now," she told Crane in their last recorded meeting, a smile touching her lips for the first time. "I hear my own voice instead, flawed but mine." He recommended gradual reintegration, perhaps volunteer work outside the order, to rebuild her sense of purpose without the crutch of delusion. The bishop, monitoring from afar, saw the case as a cautionary tale, implementing diocese-wide mental health protocols to safeguard against similar unravelings. Ruiz, closing her notebook on the investigation, reflected on the blurred lines between mind and malice, her worldview expanded by the enigma. As spring fully bloomed, the convent's garden burst with color, a metaphor for the sisters' cautious optimism. They honored the tragedy with a memorial plaque in the schoolyard, inscribed with words of remembrance, turning ashes into a foundation for growth. The disturbing truth behind the voice, that it was a fractured mind's cry for absolution, lingered as a lesson, reminding them of the mind's depths and the need for vigilance in faith's embrace. As the Chicago spring of 1989 blossomed fully, painting the convent's garden with vibrant tulips and the soft hum of bees, the scars of the fire at Our Lady of the Angel School lingered, not just in the rebuilt walls but in the hearts of those who survived its shadow. The story of Sister Helena, and the voice that guided her through a tragic inferno, a voice born from decades-old guilt and woven into a delusional tapestry of divine purpose, has unraveled before you, revealing the human mind's terrifying fragility. This wasn't just a tale of flames and loss. It was a journey into the labyrinth of a psyche fractured by trauma, where a single whisper could ignite chaos or calm, salvation or destruction. The 12 nuns, spared in their chapel annex, carried not just the weight of survival but the burden of questions that may never fully resolve. Was Helena a victim of her own mind, or a catalyst for catastrophe? Did faith blind them to her unraveling, or was it their shared vulnerability that bound them to her in that fateful moment? You've walked this dark tunnel with us, peering into the corners where light rarely reaches, and for that, you've earned a place among the rare few who dare to confront the inexplicable. This journey through the ashes of 1988 exposes a truth that lingers like smoke in the lungs. The human mind is a house of mirrors, reflecting both divine inspiration and devastating delusion, often indistinguishable until the cost is counted in lives. Helena's voice, once mistaken for an angel's, was her own fractured echo, a plea for absolution that led to 92 lost children and a community torn apart. Yet in its wake, the nuns found a path to healing, not through blind faith but through a courageous reckoning with their own doubts, fears, and shared humanity. They rebuilt not just a school, but their understanding of faith as a balance of spirit and psyche, A lesson carved in the memorial plaque that now stands in the schoolyard, its words a quiet vow to remember and learn. This story challenges us to question the voices we hear, within ourselves, within others, and to seek truth even when it burns. You, sitting there having followed this tale to its end, are part of a select group, a community of seekers who don't shy from the unsettling, who chase the threads of the bizarre and disturbing to understand what lies beneath. Your courage in facing this story mirrors the nuns' bravery in confronting their own complicity, their own silences. Take a moment to reflect. What does this tale stir in you? Perhaps a shiver of recognition, a question about the fragility of your own convictions, or a newfound empathy for those lost in their minds' shadows. I invite you to cement your place in this journey by commenting below with this exact phrase: "This story changed my way of seeing the human mind." By doing so, you signal to others, our fellow truth seekers, from city lofts to quiet towns aged 25 to 80, united by a fascination with the enigmatic, that you've delved into the heart of this mystery. Your words will mark you as one of us, a member of a community that dares to dissect the hidden truths society buries, building a network of minds unafraid to ask, what else lies in the dark? Sharing this video is more than a click. It's a ripple in the water, a chance to spread this haunting truth to others who might never otherwise glimpse the delicate line between faith and madness. Imagine the conversation sparked, the minds awakened as more discover the story of Helena's voice and its devastating echo. It's a call to action, a way to ensure that the lessons of this tragedy, about mental health, about the dangers of unchecked trauma, don't fade like embers into ash. Subscribe to this channel not just for more stories, but to become part of a movement that keeps curiosity alive, that refuses to let the inexplicable be swept under the rug. Think of it as planting a seed in a garden of questions, where each new video nurtures your hunger for the strange and sinister, feeding that part of you that lingers on unsolved riddles at midnight. Your engagement, your likes, your comments, your shares, fuels this mission to unearth what no one dares tell, to shine a light on the corners where monsters, human or otherwise, hide. You're not just a viewer. You're a co-conspirator in this search, a keeper of the flame that burns for truth. Keep watching, keep questioning, and let's together unravel the next dark secret waiting to be told. Thank you for staying until the end, for daring to see the human mind in all its fractured beauty and terror. Now let's carry this story forward, because the truth, like a fire, only grows when shared.